Deep in the forgotten hollows of Blackthorn Valley, the air feels heavier, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. Locals speak of a family that has lived here for 9 generations, a bloodline so secretive that most townsfolk avoid even saying their name aloud. The Thorne men. For centuries, they've stayed hidden behind boundary stones carved with strange, almost primal symbols. On moonless nights, travelers swear they hear cries from the woods, not quite human, not quite animal. Something that sends every instinct screaming to run. But what if those cries weren't just legend? What if a pact was made long ago, one that altered an entire lineage, slowly turning them into something else? Tonight, we enter Mill Haven, a town clinging to its last threads of normalcy, and follow one man's journey into a farmhouse where the 9th generation of this bloodline now waits, less human than ever before. The question is, do you watch or do you run? If you love eerie, slow-burn mysteries with a cinematic edge, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with a friend who enjoys the darker side of history. You're not going to want to miss where this story goes. Mist rolled low across the valley as dawn broke, clinging to the crooked fence lines that divided forgotten farmland from ancient forest. The road to Mill Haven felt like a narrowing passage into another world. Our narrator gripped the steering wheel tighter, each mile carrying him deeper into silence. He had driven through remote places before, but this stretch of wilderness seemed to watch him, as though the trees themselves kept count. The asphalt gave way to cracked dirt, rough with frost. Tires crunched over fallen branches. Somewhere in the distance, a lone crow called, its cry swallowed by the thick canopy overhead, leaving an oppressive hush. He slowed the truck as the first boundary marker came into view. A moss-covered stone standing waist-high, carved with symbols that almost resembled antlers. The markings were too precise, too deliberate, to be anything but a warning. He stepped out, boots sinking into damp earth, breath clouding in the morning air. The stone radiated an odd energy, like touching something that had stood witness to centuries of quiet rituals and unspoken agreements. He traced the carvings with a gloved hand. Sharp lines cut deep, as though whoever made them wanted permanence beyond weather, beyond time. Not just a property marker, something closer to a declaration. The road beyond the stone curved sharply, swallowed by the dense forest. For a moment he considered turning back. He could almost hear his brother's voice telling him he had no business crossing such lines. But that was why he came, to cross them. To seek out the truth about the Thorne men, about what their bloodline had become after generations of isolation and whispered bargains with the wild. The truck rattled forward again, deeper into the woods. Shafts of weak sunlight pierced the canopy, illuminating patches of pale fog. The air smelled of wet leaves and something else, a faint, musky tang. Another stone appeared on the right, partially hidden by roots from an oak, whose girth suggested it had been growing here since before the town existed. The symbols were fresher, carved more recently, maybe even this season. He felt eyes on him. Turning quickly, he saw nothing, just endless trees, trunks lined like sentinels, yet the sensation persisted, as though something crouched just beyond sight, patient enough to wait until dusk. He pushed on, breath shallow, senses sharpened. Every rustle seemed amplified, every snapping twig a potential threat. It felt less like entering someone's property and more like stepping onto sacred ground where rules were absolute. At the edge of the clearing, the first glimpse of the farmhouse appeared. Its silhouette was dark against the pale morning, sprawling but sagging in places, as though burdened by the weight of what lived within. He parked near the fence and killed the engine. Silence rushed back, broken only by the soft ticking of cooling metal. No dogs barked, no birds called. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Crossing the yard, he noticed the soil had been turned in careful rows, though no recognizable crops grew there. Strange plants, their leaves tinged blue and red, swayed despite the still air, like they were breathing. The front porch creaked under his boots. Dust coated the steps, yet there were fresh tracks, bare footprints, longer than any he had seen. Toes splayed slightly as though adapted for gripping earth rather than shoes. He knocked once. The sound seemed to echo too far, as if the house was hollow, a shell with hidden spaces. No answer came. He knocked again, harder this time, then waited. From somewhere beyond the tree line came a low, resonant call. Not a wolf, not a man, something that belonged to both worlds. It rolled through the valley, raising the hair along his arms. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, tall and straight-backed, wearing a dark coat despite the mild morning. He walked with an unsettling smoothness, each step too fluid, almost gliding over the ground. As the man drew closer, his face came into view, sharp features, pale eyes that seemed to reflect light rather than catch it. His gaze locked on the visitor with the intensity of a predator. "You've crossed our boundary," he said evenly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that felt final. "Few from the town come this far. Fewer still leave with anything they wish to keep." The visitor swallowed, forcing steady breath. "I'm here for history," he said, trying to sound professional. "To document the truth about Mill Haven and the disappearances. I believe your family's story is part of it." A faint smile crossed the man's face, humorless and cold. "History is not free," he said. "Our story carries a price. Most who seek it decide they cannot afford what it demands." The man gestured toward the stone at the clearing's edge. "Do you know what these markers mean?" he asked. When the visitor shook his head, the man's smile widened slightly. "They warn, not forbid. Those who cross consent." "Consent to what?" the visitor asked. "To witness," the man replied simply. "And to be witnessed." The forest seemed to grow darker around them, the light shifting though the sun hadn't moved. It was as if the trees themselves leaned closer, eager to hear the answer. "I came to see for myself," the visitor said finally. His words sounded braver than he felt. "I won't leave until I know what happened here. To those men who vanished." The man's expression turned unreadable, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then you will know," he said. "But understand this. Once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you cross, you cannot uncross." He stepped aside, motioning toward the path that led deeper onto the property. "Come before noon tomorrow," he instructed. "The family will decide whether you are permitted further. Until then, stay clear of the tree line at night." The visitor turned back toward his truck, heart pounding. As he started the engine, he glanced once more at the man who stood motionless, watching him leave. The pale eyes caught the light, unblinking. Driving back toward town, the forest seemed to close behind him. The stones on either side of the road felt less like markers now, more like sentinels ensuring he didn't linger where he wasn't yet welcome. By the time he reached the main road, the morning mist had burned away, but the sense of being marked remained. He wasn't sure whether the encounter had been a warning or an invitation. Back at the inn, he spread out his notes on the desk, tracing the symbols he had seen. They repeated in patterns, forming a language he couldn't yet read, but somehow understood to mean threshold. He remembered the man's words: witness and be witnessed. Whatever happened next, he had already crossed the first line. The forest knew him now, the Thorne men knew him, and there was no going back. Night fell quickly in Mill Haven, as if the valley swallowed the sun whole. From his window, he could see the distant outline of the forest. Somewhere out there, something waited for him to return, and he would, because the boundary stones weren't just warnings, they were invitations. The morning came gray and heavy, the sky sagging low over Mill Haven as if reluctant to let the sun rise. Our narrator woke early, haunted by dreams of pale eyes watching from the tree line. He drove back toward the valley, the truck's tires hissing on wet pavement from an overnight drizzle. The forest swallowed him once again, the road narrowing, trees leaning closer like curious onlookers. The first boundary stone appeared faster than expected, its surface slick with moisture, the strange markings glistening as if freshly cut. He slowed and touched the stone in passing, feeling a shiver climb his arm. Ahead, the clearing opened like a throat, revealing the Thorne property shrouded in fog. This time, the figure was already waiting, standing beside the porch steps, motionless, as though he had been expecting the visitor all along. The man's coat was the same, dark and spotless despite the damp air. His pale eyes reflected the weak daylight. He inclined his head once, the movement oddly formal, before speaking in that measured voice. "You returned," he said, almost approvingly. "Few do." The visitor stepped from the truck, careful not to appear confrontational. "You asked me to come. I kept my word." The man gestured toward the porch. "Then keep it further," he said, leading the way. The boards groaned beneath their weight as they crossed to the door. Inside, the air smelled of earth, smoke, and something faintly metallic, a smell that felt ancient, as if it belonged to a place untouched by time. The entryway was dim, lit only by slats of light through warped shutters. The furniture was plain, handcrafted, built for utility rather than comfort. Everything bore the weight of use and history, polished by generations of hands. "Sit," the man said, pulling a chair from the table. He sat opposite, folding long fingers on the wood. "My name is Elias Thorne. This land has belonged to my bloodline since 1797. The visitor repeated the name silently. Thorne. The word felt heavy, like the stones at the property line. "You've heard what people say about your family," he said carefully, "that you keep to yourselves, that men go missing." Elias's pale eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained controlled. "People fear what they do not understand," he replied, "and sometimes fear is justified. This place is not forgiving to strangers." The visitor leaned forward. "Then tell me what I need to understand. Why are there warnings carved into your boundary stones? Why does the town speak of you as though you're not entirely human?" For a moment, Elias said nothing, his gaze holding the visitor still. Then he stood with sudden grace, moving toward a shelf near the fireplace. He took down an object wrapped in cloth and placed it on the table. When he unwrapped it, a small locket lay revealed, silver worn dull with age, engraved with the same symbols seen on the stones. Elias opened it to reveal compartments, each containing a lock of hair. "These belong to our forebears," Elias said. "Each generation recorded here. Each changed in some way from the last. Our bloodline does not remain static. It adapts, sometimes violently, to what this land demands." The visitor studied the hair samples. Some looked normal, others coarser, thicker, almost animal. "You're saying your family is evolving?" "Becoming," Elias corrected softly. "Each generation carries forward something older than man, something the first Thorne awakened when he made his bargain." The visitor's stomach tightened. Bargain with what? Elias's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "With survival," he said simply. "This valley starved settlers in that first winter. My ancestor went into the forest and came back changed, but alive." He returned the locket to its wrapping with almost reverent care. "The price of that survival runs through us still. It shows in our bodies, our senses, our hungers." The visitor's throat felt dry. "And those who vanish near here? Is that part of the price too?" Elias was silent long enough that the visitor wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, he said, "Those who ignore warnings sometimes meet the forest on its own terms, and the forest is rarely merciful." Outside, something howled, low, distant, yet close enough to vibrate the walls. The sound was neither wolf nor man, something caught between. Elias did not move, only tilted his head slightly, listening. "You should leave before dusk," Elias said finally. "Return tomorrow if you must, but leave before night. This is not a place for men without ties to the land after dark." The visitor stood, heart-thudding, sensing the conversation was over. "Tomorrow, then," he said quietly. Elias nodded once. "Tomorrow," he echoed, already turning away, his attention shifting to something beyond the visitor's understanding, as though he was listening to sounds no one else could hear. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, but the forest still seemed to close in, branches forming an arch over the path back to the truck. The air tasted of rain and something metallic, faint as blood. The drive back to town felt longer than before. Every shadow seemed to hold movement, every clearing a pair of watching eyes. When he reached the main road, he exhaled sharply, realizing he had been holding his breath. At the inn, he spread out his notes again, adding sketches of the locket and the markings on the boundary stones. He wrote down Elias's words carefully, as if they might vanish if not captured quickly. Sleep came slowly, haunted by the sound of that inhuman howl and the memory of pale, unblinking eyes across the table. Morning would bring answers, or draw him further into something he could not escape. He turned off the light, but outside the valley remained awake, the forest humming softly, like a living thing waiting for him to step back into its grasp. Morning light stretched long across the valley, thin as if reluctant to touch the Thorne property. The visitor's truck bounced along the dirt road, carrying him once more toward the place that felt less like farmland and more like a threshold. The farmhouse loomed from the fog again, its windows dark as though the building watched him approach. Elias was waiting near the porch, coat buttoned to the throat, posture so still it seemed carved from the same wood as the house. Without a word, Elias gestured toward the door. The visitor followed, each step sounding impossibly loud in the morning silence. When the door creaked open, the house exhaled cold air that smelled faintly of earth and smoke. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through heavy curtains that dulled the morning into perpetual dusk. The wooden floors were worn smooth, the grain polished by generations of boots pacing through seasons of hunger, storms, and watchfulness. The hallway was narrow, walls lined with portraits. The earliest showed men in colonial clothing, stern-faced, their eyes too sharp, too aware. As the portraits progressed, subtle differences appeared. Jawlines lengthened, irises lightened, musculature grew strangely defined. Elias moved silently ahead, his presence unsettling in its quiet. He led the visitor toward the largest room in the house, a parlor dominated by a fireplace that could have roasted an entire stag. Chairs of varying shapes surrounded a massive table, some built too high or too low for ordinary use, as though designed for men of unusual proportions. The visitor's skin prickled at the thought of who had sat there. "You wish to see," Elias said at last, motioning toward the walls. "This is our record." The visitor stepped closer to the portraits, unable to resist. Each generation looked less ordinary than the last, features stretched or sharpened, bodies almost predatory in stance. By the sixth generation, the men depicted bore unmistakable animal influence, elongated limbs, claw-like nails painted with unsettling precision, gazes that seemed to follow as though the eyes still held living intelligence within the canvas. "These were painted here," Elias said quietly. "Each generation we add to the collection. The seventh chose not to be painted. The eighth left no likeness at all." The visitor turned back. "And the ninth?" Elias's mouth tightened slightly. "We exist between the two choices," he said, "neither hidden completely nor fully shown. Our generation is complicated." The words hung heavy, as though he spoke not just of himself, but of an entire bloodline teetering between man and something older. A faint sound rose from deeper in the house. Low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, but too deep, too resonant to belong to any man. The visitor stiffened, instinct prickling. "They are awake," Elias said softly, as though to himself. Then louder, "Come. You must meet the one who remembers." He led the visitor down another hall, this one curving slightly, the floors sloping as if the house had grown like a living thing rather than been built. The air cooled, damp with something subterranean. At the end stood a heavy wooden door, carved with the same symbols as the boundary stones. Elias knocked once, the sound echoing like a drum beat through the silence before he pushed it open. Inside, a fire burned low in an enormous hearth. Beside it sat an ancient man in a high-backed chair, his form massive despite age, his skin weathered, hands thick and scarred by decades of work. His hair was white but coarse, almost bristled. When he lifted his head, his eyes gleamed milky but sharp, like they could see into the marrow of a man. "This is Abraham Thorne," Elias said with quiet respect. "My grandfather." The old man's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "So, another seeker." The visitor swallowed but held his ground. "I want to know the truth, about what your family is, about why men disappear near here." Abraham chuckled, a sound that vibrated in his chest. "You think you are the first to ask? The first to come knocking at our door with questions heavier than your courage can carry?" "I came because I need answers," the visitor said, his voice steady though his hands trembled. Abraham nodded once. "Then you shall have them. Sit." The chair creaked under the visitor's weight. The fire threw shadows across Abraham's face, revealing the strange angles of his jaw, the subtle forward thrust of his nose, traits that seemed almost animal yet dignified. "Your town fears us," Abraham said. "They have reason. We are not entirely what we once were. This bloodline was touched by something ancient, and it has shaped us for 9 generations." The visitor's mouth felt dry. "Touched by what?" "By the forest itself," Abraham said, eyes narrowing with memory. "By something older than man, something that remembers when men still walked afraid of the dark." He gestured toward a massive book resting on the table beside him. The leather cover was worn but strong, the pages thick and edged with soot from years near the fire. "This is our bestiary," Abraham said. "Every birth, every change, every loss, recorded since the first Thorne settled here. Would you look upon it?" The visitor nodded. Abraham opened the book with careful hands, revealing sketches that grew progressively stranger. The earliest pages showed normal men, but by the 4th generation, their eyes were slit-pupiled, their hands ending in curved nails. "This is what we are," Abraham said, voice even. "Not cursed, not blessed, simply changed." The visitor felt the weight of the room press in. The fire crackled. Somewhere beyond the door, another sound echoed. A shuffle, a scrape, as if something enormous moved just out of sight. Abraham closed the book and leaned forward, his gaze sharp despite its clouded appearance. "You still wish to stay?" The visitor hesitated, the urge to run clashing with the need for answers. "Yes," he said finally. "I came for the truth. I will see it through." Elias's expression shifted slightly, approval flashing in those pale eyes. "Then tomorrow night you will witness more than words. You will see with your own eyes what it means to be Thorne." The visitor rose, legs unsteady, his heart hammering in his chest. Abraham's gaze followed him to the door, heavy as a verdict. As Elias led him back through the twisting corridors, the house seemed to breathe around them, each groan of the floorboards like a warning. Outside, the air hit his lungs sharp and cold. The sun had dipped low, the sky bruised purple. He realized he had been inside for hours. Elias stood at the edge of the porch. "Leave now," he said softly. Return before sundown tomorrow. After that, there are no promises. The visitor nodded and climbed into his truck, casting one last glance at the farmhouse. In the window above, a shadow shifted, tall and bent, watching him until he turned onto the road. As the truck rattled away, the forest seemed to whisper, branches brushing against one another like fingers. The line had been crossed now. Tomorrow, the house would reveal more, and there would be no turning back. The next day broke colder, the sky streaked with iron-gray clouds that promised rain by nightfall. The visitor dressed with deliberate care, every movement slowed by the weight of what waited beyond the valley road. He drove in silence, tires humming on wet pavement. The forest swallowed him again, darker than before, as though the trees had moved closer overnight. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he passed the first stone. When the farmhouse came into view, Elias was already waiting, standing at the base of the porch like a sentinel. The man's pale eyes gleamed even in the dim light, unreadable, yet focused. "This way," Elias said simply, turning without further greeting. The visitor followed through the front hall, boots thudding softly on wood polished to a dull sheen. The house seemed quieter, but the silence felt heavy, watchful. Abraham sat waiting in the great parlor, firelight carving deep shadows across his powerful frame. The massive book lay open on the table beside him, pages already turned to a place he had chosen for today. "You asked yesterday what touched our line," Abraham said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "You wished to know the price of our survival. You shall hear it now, without interruption." The visitor sat, leaning forward slightly, every muscle tense. The fire crackled. Rain tapped faintly against the windows. Elias remained standing near the doorway, his expression carved from stone, silent witness to his grandfather's words. "In 1797, Abraham began, Jeremiah Thorne brought his family here, fleeing famine further east. The winter was crueler than he could endure. He went into the deep woods seeking meat, roots, anything to keep them alive." Abraham's milky eyes glimmered with firelight. He found something instead. Not man, not beast, not spirit. Something that had been here before the first axe struck these trees. It saw his desperation and offered him a choice. The visitor swallowed. "What choice?" "Survival," Abraham said simply. "But survival is never free. Jeremiah agreed to consume what it gave. Flesh not of any animal he knew. He brought it back to his sons. They all survived." Abraham turned the book toward the visitor, revealing a page in Jeremiah's own handwriting. The ink was faded but legible, describing the first changes: longer nights of wakefulness, heightened senses, cravings for raw meat. "The first generation could still pass among men," Abraham said, "but the changes deepened with each son born. By the third generation, eyes glowed in firelight. By the fifth, some could no longer sleep indoors." The visitor's breath quickened. "And by the ninth?" Abraham's expression hardened. "You have already seen some of us," he said. "You know the answer." A sound echoed from deep within the house, a chorus of voices, not quite human, rising and falling like some ancient chant. The visitor's skin crawled. "The pact must be renewed each generation," Abraham continued. "The forest demands it. Blood renews blood. If we fail, we wither, we die, and something older than grief comes to reclaim us." The visitor's chest felt tight. "So the disappearances—" "Not all who vanish are unwilling," Abraham said, his tone even. "Some come seeking what you seek, answers. Some stay. Others do not pass the trial. The forest keeps what it is owed." The fire hissed as a log collapsed into embers. Elias finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Tomorrow is the equinox. The ninth generation must complete the rite. You may witness, if you are willing." The visitor hesitated, fear wrestling with the compulsion that had brought him here. What happens during this rite? You will see, Abraham said. And once seen, you will not forget. That is the nature of our truth. It does not wash away with dawn. Rain struck harder against the windows now, wind moaning through the eaves as if the house itself responded. Somewhere upstairs, a heavy footstep sounded, followed by a dragging noise, slow and deliberate. Elias's head turned sharply toward the sound, then back to the visitor. "Stay near the fire tonight," he said. "There are rooms here where men have entered and never returned." The visitor nodded slowly, fighting the urge to flee. "I will stay." Abraham closed the book with a heavy thud, the sound final. "Then tomorrow, you will see the forest father take his due." The word sent a chill through the visitor's bones. He sat in silence as the fire burned lower, shadows creeping longer along the walls, portraits staring down like silent witnesses to centuries of bargains kept. When Elias finally led him back to the guest room, the house felt alive, every board groaning softly as though breathing. The visitor glanced back toward the parlor, half expecting to see glowing eyes in the dark. In the small room, an oil lamp burned low, its light weak against the pressing gloom. Elias paused at the door. "Whatever you hear tonight, do not leave this room until I return." The visitor nodded, throat dry. "And if I do?" Elias's pale eyes caught the lamplight, unblinking. "Then you may not see dawn." The door shut softly behind him. The visitor sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The house creaked. Far off, something howled, answered by another voice closer, too close. He gripped the edge of the mattress, forcing himself to stay seated. The instinct to run battled with the knowledge that the forest was worse than whatever waited just beyond this door. Hours passed, measured only by the steady tick of an old clock in the hallway. At last, footsteps returned. The latch clicked, and Elias's silhouette filled the doorway. "Come," he said. "The sun is down. The house is ready." The visitor rose, legs stiff, following Elias into the corridor. The air smelled of smoke and iron now, stronger than before, as though the entire house had been prepared for some ancient ceremony. They descended the main staircase in silence. At the bottom, Abraham waited, seated tall and straight despite his years. He nodded once. "It is time." The visitor felt the finality in those words. Whatever would be revealed tonight, there would be no way back to ignorance, no way to pretend he had never crossed the stones. Together they moved toward a narrow door at the far end of the hall, its wood dark with age, carved with the same symbols as the stones. Elias unlocked it with a heavy iron key. Cold air swept from the passage beyond, smelling of damp earth. Torches burned along the walls, their flames guttering in some invisible draft, casting shifting shadows that seemed to writhe across the stone floor. The visitor hesitated at the threshold, feeling the weight of generations pressing down from the portraits above. Then he stepped forward, and the door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin ceiling. The stone corridor sloped downward, the air growing colder with every step. Moisture glistened on the walls, and the faint smell of earth filled the visitor's lungs, as though he were descending into the valley's hidden heart. Torches cast shuddering shadows that moved like living things. Each step echoed far too loudly, as though the house above had vanished entirely, and the world beyond this tunnel no longer existed. Elias walked ahead, his stride unbroken, his tall silhouette unwavering against the shifting light. The visitor followed, pulse hammering in his ears, a strange part of him wondering if he would ever climb back. The passage opened into a cavern so vast it seemed impossible it lay beneath the farmhouse. Rough stone walls stretched upward into darkness, roots dangling like skeletal fingers. A fire burned in a wide pit at the center. Around the fire stood 6 men, their faces painted with streaks of black ash, their torsos bare despite the cold. Their eyes reflected the firelight in pale flashes, sharp as predatory animals in the dark. Abraham entered last, leaning on a staff carved from twisted oak. When he spoke, his voice carried through the cavern like a bell, resonant and commanding. "The ninth stands ready," he said. "The pact must be renewed." Elias motioned the visitor closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You wish to see," he murmured. "Then see everything." The fire crackled, sparks spiraling upward toward the unseen roof. One of the men stepped forward and cast a bundle of dried herbs into the flames. A heavy, pungent smoke rose, filling the cavern with a bitter tang. Abraham began to chant, words in a language the visitor could not place. Old, harsh syllables that rasped like bark being torn from a tree. The other men joined, their voices forming a low, vibrating chorus. The visitor's skin prickled as the chanting built in intensity. His vision swam slightly in the smoke, colors sharpening unnaturally, every detail of the men's faces suddenly too clear, every line of muscle standing out like carved stone. One by one, the men cut their palms with bone knives and let blood drip into the fire. The flames hissed, burning brighter, turning from orange to a strange, pale silver that bathed the chamber. Abraham extended the knife toward Elias, who took it without hesitation and cut his own palm. His blood fell into the flames with a hiss that made the visitor's stomach clench. Then Abraham turned toward him, offering the knife. "You are here," the old man said, voice low. "You must choose. Witness as a stranger, or take the cut and become part of what you see." The visitor's hand shook as he took the blade. The bone handle was warm, as if alive. He drew it across his palm, the sting sharp and immediate, blood spilling into the silver fire. The cavern seemed to shudder. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the stone, neither entirely physical nor entirely imagined. The fire roared higher, revealing shadows on the walls, shapes too tall, too twisted to belong to men. The men threw back their heads and howled in unison, a sound that began human but ended with a note that vibrated somewhere beyond speech, a sound that made the visitor's bones feel hollow. Elias stepped into the firelight fully, and for the first time the visitor saw the subtle shifts of his form. Muscles rippling under skin, features sharpening, his entire presence growing larger, more primal. The others followed, their bodies seeming to stretch as if the forest itself reached through them. The sound of bones shifting filled the air, not grotesque but strangely graceful, like branches bending under wind. Abraham raised both hands and the fire dimmed to a pale glow. The chanting stopped, leaving a silence so deep the visitor could hear his own ragged breathing echo in the cavern. When Abraham spoke, his words were different now, older. "The forest remembers," he said. "The pact holds. Our blood remains bound to its root and stone. Its hunger becomes ours, and ours becomes its." The men moved around the fire in a slow circle, bare feet scuffing patterns into the dirt floor. Elias passed close to the visitor, his pale eyes shining with something beyond human recognition. The smoke grew thicker, almost tangible, curling around the visitor's arms like fingers. He felt himself sway, every part of him torn between terror and awe. Something vast and ancient pressed close, brushing his thoughts. The fire suddenly flared, throwing light across the cavern ceiling. For an instant, the visitor saw enormous antlered shapes outlined above, like the shadows of creatures standing just beyond the stone, watching. Abraham struck his staff against the ground, the sound ringing like a crack of thunder. "It is done," he intoned. "The 9th generation stands unbroken." The flames sank lower, returning to their natural color. The smoke thinned, leaving the cavern smelling of ash, blood, and earth. The men stood breathing heavily, their skins slick with sweat despite the cold. Elias faced the visitor, his chest rising and falling, eyes still gleaming. "You have seen," he said. You cannot go back to the town unchanged. Whether you leave or remain, you are part of this night now." The visitor nodded numbly, words lost in his throat. Every sound seemed muted except the drum of his heartbeat and the crackle of dying fire. Abraham stepped closer, his massive hand resting briefly on the visitor's shoulder. "Go," he said quietly. "Sleep under this roof tonight. Tomorrow, you decide whether to leave these stones behind or cross them forever." The men dispersed silently, their footsteps vanishing into the shadows at the edges of the cavern. Elias guided the visitor back through the passage, the tunnel seeming longer than before, its air heavier. When they emerged into the house, the night outside had deepened, rain streaking the windows. The visitor stumbled slightly, his legs unsteady, as though some invisible weight had been left behind in the earth. Elias handed him a cup of water. "Drink," he said. "You will need your strength." The visitor drank, the coolness clearing some of the haze from his head. "What happens if I stay?" he asked. Elias's expression softened only slightly. "Then you become part of the next season's tale," he said, "and the forest will know your name." He left the visitor alone in the small room. Outside, the rain fell harder, but beneath it, the visitor could still hear the faint echo of the chant, as though the earth itself continued to sing. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of silver fire, antlered shadows, and pale-eyed men standing guard at the forest's edge, waiting for him to choose which path would claim the rest of his life. Dawn broke gray and silent over Mill Haven, the rain gone but leaving the earth soaked and glistening. The visitor stood at the window of the small room, staring toward the distant tree line. The house was quiet now, but not empty. Somewhere below, he could hear low voices, Elias's measured tone, Abraham's deep rumble. They spoke as though deciding something final, their words too soft to catch. He washed his face in the cold basin, the water shockingly clear, as though it had been drawn straight from some hidden spring. His reflection looked older, harder, as if the night had carved lines into him. When Elias appeared at the door, he carried none of the solemnity of the previous night, only calm. "It is time," he said, his voice gentle but unyielding. "You must choose before the sun reaches its height." The visitor followed him into the main room, where Abraham sat before the fire, staff across his knees. The old man's gaze was steady, his presence heavy with the weight of generations. "You have seen," Abraham said simply. "You have bled into the fire. Now you must answer. Do you leave this place behind, or do you stay and take our burden as your own?" The visitor's throat was tight. He had imagined this moment since crossing the first stone, but imagining it and standing in it were entirely different. The air seemed to press against him, demanding a response. "If I leave," he said, forcing the words past dry lips, "what happens?" "You forget nothing," Abraham replied. "The forest keeps your memory. You will hear us in the wind, see us in the corners of your dreams, but you will remain outside." The visitor turned to Elias. "And if I stay?" Elias's pale eyes caught the firelight, glinting strangely. "Then the forest claims you," he said. "You will change, as we have changed. You will never again walk as other men do." The visitor looked toward the door, toward the gray horizon beyond. His chest ached with the pull between freedom and the strange belonging he had felt in the cavern. He stepped outside, boots sinking into wet soil. The morning smelled of moss and wood smoke, heavy with the damp richness of earth. The stones gleamed with dew, marking the edge between two lives. He walked to the nearest one, tracing its carvings with his fingers. They felt different now, as though pulsing faintly, alive with the memory of the ritual fire and the voices that had filled the cavern. Behind him, Elias waited without speaking, his presence patient but unrelenting. Abraham remained inside, trusting the choice to be made without further urging. The visitor's hand clenched. He thought of the town, of returning to ordinary days haunted by the knowledge of what lay hidden just beyond its edge. The thought filled him with hollow dread. He turned back toward Elias, heart pounding. "I stay," he said finally. The words quiet, but carrying a weight he felt in his bones. Elias's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders eased, as though he had been waiting for this answer longer than the visitor had been alive. "Then come," Elias said. "You must be marked before nightfall." They returned to the house where Abraham rose slowly, his staff thudding once against the floor. "So be it," he said. The forest gains another sun. The visitor was led back down into the earth, the torches burning brighter now, as though anticipating what was to come. The cavern felt warmer, charged with an unseen current that prickled across his skin. The fire pit had been cleared and rebuilt. Fresh herbs hung in bundles, their sharp scent filling the air. The men of the 9th generation stood waiting, faces solemn, as though this moment bound them too. Abraham motioned the visitor into the circle. "Kneel," he said. This time, no smoke rose. Instead, the flames flared white, so bright it hurt to look at them. The cavern walls glowed, revealing those massive antlered shadows again, closer than before, almost tangible. Abraham pressed his staff to the visitor's shoulder. "You are bound," he intoned. "The forest knows you now. When it calls, you will answer. When it hungers, you will feed it." The visitor felt a strange warmth flood his body, not pain, but an overwhelming sense of connection. To the fire, the stones, the roots beneath the earth. His breath came ragged, his pulse thundering. The men began to chant softly, a song both mournful and triumphant. Elias helped him to his feet, steadying him when his legs nearly gave way. "Breathe," Elias said quietly. "You belong now. Let the valley hold you." The visitor inhaled deeply. The cavern air no longer smelled of smoke, but of rain-soaked earth, pine resin, and something wild and electric that made his senses sharpen until every detail stood out crystalline and clear. When the flames finally sank low, the circle broke. The men clasped his arms one by one, acknowledging him without words. Their grips were firm, their eyes steady, recognizing him as one of their own. Abraham placed both hands on his shoulders. "You will learn in time," he said. "The change does not come all at once, but when it does, you will not fear it." They left the cavern together, climbing toward the faint daylight spilling through the open door above. The air outside felt different now, less hostile, as though the entire valley had accepted his presence. He stood on the porch, staring at the distant forest. The trees no longer seemed to lean menacingly. Instead, they stood like silent guardians, waiting for him to step among them when the season demanded. Elias stood beside him, silent for a long moment before speaking. "You cross the stones," he said. "Now you cannot uncross them. Whatever the town remembers of you, you are no longer theirs." The visitor nodded slowly, the truth of the words settling into him like roots digging deep. Somewhere in the forest a cry rose, no longer frightening but calling, welcoming him home. The farmhouse stood behind him, the valley stretched before him, and for the first time since arriving, he felt steady. Whatever came next, he would meet it as one of the Thorne men.